Okay, so we've got our chocolate sponge cake here that's been made earlier. So this will be the third tier of the cake, and it's an 8-inch sponge. Now all we're going to do is put some buttercream on this. It's summertime at the moment in Australia, so it's very hot, so I've actually had to keep the milk out of the buttercream recipe just so it doesn't turn. Alright, now in order to make sure that it's as level as possible, what we'll need to do is actually cut the cake into 3 slices and rearrange them. Okay, so what you're going to need to separate this cake easily is a bread knife, and what we're going to do firstly is just mark out the layers that we're going to cut. So we're going to take the straight edge of the bread knife, and what we're going to do is just make 2 lines roughly where you want your layers to be. And that's it. So you've got your lines down the side, and then we're going to start actually cutting the cake into its levels so we can put that buttercream on. Okay, so obviously we're going to turn the knife around, so we've got the serrated edge here. We're going to mark it at the top line. Now we're not going to saw through the cake because it's going to make unnecessary crumbs. What we're going to do is just push gently through diagonally, focusing more on the end that's closer to you, not over this side where you can't see, because you want it to become even. So we're just pushing through as we're turning the cake, making sure that that line is meeting up nicely with the knife. We just continue to do that until you can feel that you've cut through the entire cake. Alright, so I can feel that that's loosened, and then I can just remove that section there. We go again for the next level, so doing the same thing. So we've got our 3 layers of cake there, and as you can see the surfaces are quite flat, and that's what we want for our crumb coating. Okay, so what we're going to do now is take the flattest layer and figure out which one that is, and that'll essentially become the top of the cake. It'll be much easier to get a smooth finish if you've got the flattest possible layer. Any bits that might be slightly uneven, what we can use is our buttercream basically to level that out. So firstly, this is the bottom layer, and that's what we'll be using as the top. So I'll just put that aside. Now, as I mentioned, I don't have a cake stand, so it does make things a little bit tricky, but I do have these tins there. This is the 8-inch one that this cake was cooked in, and it actually has the bottom that comes out. So I'm actually going to use this as the base for my cake. I don't like too much space between the bottom of the cake and the surface that we're working on, because when we put the fondant on, it's just going to weigh down that fondant and it'll cause some cracking, which we obviously don't want. So now the middle layer of the cake is going to be my base, so I'm going to pop that there, and then what we're going to do is just take some of our buttercream and then what I'm going to do is just pop this into the fridge and just let that set. And then I can put a small thin layer on just to make sure that the surface is level so we don't have the cake kind of on a slant. Okay, so the cream is set. We've layered that off again. It actually turned out quite even. What I did is just grabbed the end of a knife and hot knifed it, so just swiped it across. Place the next layer on top of the cake, and then we're just going to follow the same process again. We'll pop this in the fridge and we'll come back and do the next section. Okay, so I've got the cake out of the fridge. It's been in there for about 5 minutes and it's just set enough that, you know, you can tap on it and not really that much is going to come off on your fingers. Alright, so going down at eye level, I can see that it's at a slight slope here. If you fix up the layers as they come up, it's going to stop extra problems at the top layer trying to kind of add so much cream to layer that bit off. So the slant is down here, so of course I'm going to just add enough cream to this side. Just to make sure that it's nice and even. So that's looking pretty good. We'll put the next layer on, making sure that it's nice and even with the rest of the cake. And then any bits on the side, as you can see, that's a bit wider. We can actually fill that in with some cream, or you can cut around the edge and actually use that excess cuttings to put in there and fill in that gap, and then use the cream to level it out. So same thing again. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with that. We'll pop that in the fridge and leave it to set. Okay, so now that the butter icing has set a little bit, what we're going to do is a method called hot knifing. So you'll use something like this, or what's called a cake scraper, and it's basically a longer portion of this. It's just a flat piece of metal or steel or whatever it is, and you just drag it around the side of the cake after you've dipped it in the boiling water, and that'll actually have a really good effect. There we go. Now that's flat enough for me to put that in the fridge, and then what we'll do is just repeat the process again, and then you'll have a nice glass-like finishing on that. Of course, if you're running out of time, you could just let that set, use a pastry brush and some sugar water, and actually use that pastry brush to smooth that down nicely. Okay, so what we're going to do now is make some paw decorations for the second tier of the cake. Now there's a few ways that you can do this. I'll show you one of them and talk you through the other two, and then you can make up your own mind. What we're going to need is some white icing that's been pre-made and some black icing. That recipe for the icing will be included at the end of this video, so check that out, especially the black one, because it is hard to get a proper black colour with some of the dyes that you can get out there. Remember to use the gel dyes. The liquid dyes will change the consistency of your fondant and make it really hard to work with you. You'll end up basically with a sticky mess. So what we're going to do is just take a little bit of white fondant, and that's going to work for the outline. Now, you're going to want these to be as stiff as possible. So I'll just go and get this powder, and it's called Tylose powder. And basically what we're going to do is just knead a little bit of Tylose into this fondant, and it will become a much stiffer fondant, and as it hardens it'll become easier to stick on the cake instead of becoming out of shape when you're trying to do that. Now I've basically put only about 1/4 teaspoon on there. You could probably even use a bit less, but I am running out of time to finish this cake, so I'm going to put a little bit extra in there. Now we're going to knead the dough so the Tylose gets in there pretty well. It's very dry, so it's probably best just to do it in your hands, just like this. Okay, and I can feel that all that Tylose is mixed through there. So I'm going to put this into a bit of plastic to avoid it drying out too quickly while we mix some Tylose through the black fondant. Just give my hands a bit of a wipe there. Now when you're working with the black fondant, you might notice that my hands are slightly stained. There's a few different ways that you can get that off. It's not really good for your skin, but Jif is a good idea. Or any sort of white-based powdered cleaning products that you'd use for your kitchen bench or your bathroom bench. Alright, so we've got the black. Now we're just going to be working on one pour at a time. As you can see, that's still a little bit sticky, even with the gel fondant. Always remember to keep your fondant covered. You don't want any air getting to that while you're not working with it, or it will dry out. If it does dry out, you can add some vegetable shortening to it. It might assist to get it back. If it doesn't, you'll basically just have to start again. So, sprinkle a bit of Tylose on this. And we're just going to make sure that that's well and truly throughout the fondant there. It'll also help to stop it from being so sticky. And it dissolves in there quite easily, as you can see. Alright. We'll pop that back under some plastic. And we'll wipe our hands again. You might get some of that black dye transfer onto your hands, and you certainly don't want that on the white fondant. This is a silicone mat, and with these you'll actually find that you won't need to sprinkle very much icing sugar or corn flour or whatever you use on that to stop it from sticking, it'll actually peel off quite easily. If you're doing a larger section of fondant, you might still want just a slight sprinkle of either. I tend to use icing sugar, but corn flour, icing sugar, whatever you like. It's just a case of personal preference there. So we'll get our white fondant back. Now we don't need to be too precise with the outline of the white fondant, because we're going to end up cutting around that anyhow. Alright. So basically we'll grab our rolling pin. Depending on the consistency of your fondant, you can sprinkle a little bit of icing sugar or corn flour onto the rolling pin, but basically just test to see how it is at the start. And if you feel that you need any at any time, definitely just put some on your hands and wipe it across. Now we're just going to roll this into just a rough circular pattern. Doesn't need to be too precise. You don't want to put too much weight on the rolling pin. The weight of the rolling pin itself will do a lot of that work. Now it is sticking a little bit, but I'm going to try to do it without that icing sugar, because it can lead to it cracking and the appearance just isn't quite as good. Especially with that Tylose powder in there, that'll dry it out a little bit as well. Alright, so we're just going to be using this inside area for the paw. If you do want to make it a little bit more perfect, what you can do is just put a really little amount of vegetable shortening on your fingers and just smooth it out, and that'll actually give it a bit of a smoother appearance. We'll grab our black. Now, there are a few different ways that you can do this. If you want to go for a really crisp professional look, you can get an actual stencil they sell of dog prints, which is much easier, and you can just push that in and of course it's going to come out with that shape. Another way that you can do it is you can actually print out an outline of a paw print on a bit of paper, put it over your fondant, and then just with a pencil or any type of tool, like this one here, it's a fondant tool, you can actually push in and create the indent so you know where you're cutting. I'm just going to go freehand on this one and see how it turns out. Now, we're only going to want a tiny little ball for the actual toe prints, but we want to make sure that they're relatively even. So we'll get 3 of those. And then for the pad of the dog's foot, it's obviously going to want to be a bit bigger. Not too big though, because we don't want the print to be too thick. So about that ratio looks good to me. Obviously we'll be flattening those down. So I'll just give my hands a bit of a wipe. Make sure your hands are dry after you wash them as well. You don't want water messing with the consistency here. So it's just very rough. As I said, you can do it the other ways and it's going to give a more professional finish. But for this one, I'm just going to do it freehand and I think it'll turn out okay. Now basically what you're going to do is pop the toe prints on and you're just pressing, kind of joining the white and the black fondant together and kind of smudging it in. You can use one of these tools and kind of press it in that way, but I do prefer to use my fingers because it gives me a lot more control over what I'm doing. Each toe print you want roughly the same size. If you want to get it perfect, definitely go and get one of those stencils or print it out and trace the outline yourself. And we're just pushing in very gently and maneuvering the fondant to the desired shape. You want to make sure that both of the fondants kind of become one, that you don't just have black sitting on the white, but it's actually incorporated into the white underneath. We're going to take the next bit of fondant for the pad of the puppy's foot. Make sort of like a tear-shaped shape of fondant there, and flatten that down between your fingers. And I'll push that down there just so it sticks enough so we can maneuver it. And it's going to be quite stretchy, so don't worry too much at this point that it's too small. As I said, we don't want it too thick. Alright, now it's just a matter of kind of using your fingers to get the shape that you want there. And making sure that they are conjoined and that the black is really pushed into that white. Make sure you work with one at a time. I'm probably going to end up using about 12 of these for the second tier of the cake. Alright, so that's a pretty good shape paw print, I think, a freehand. What we're going to do now is actually get a knife and cut around the outline of that paw print and get rid of this excess here. With the excess here, I've done this quick enough that we can actually roll that back up to do the next paw print. Alright, so we'll get this done. I've just got another one of the fondant tools, just a little knife there. These are really good. With a lot of the other knives, just normal kitchen knives, you'll find that they're too thick or that the fondant sticks to them and it's not very nice to work with. Now, we're just going to get maybe about a 2mm outline around this whole paw. Let's cut off a lot of this excess here. Any excess fondant that you have, always get rid of that and it'll avoid the extra weight tearing as you're cutting around. Now just cut out little bits at a time. Oh, don't try to kind of cut around the whole edge at once. Use your knife to get rid of the bits. Now another option is just to get the black outline without the white underneath and just stick them directly onto your cake, but I think this will give it a better finish in the end. So you can see with this silicone mat that the fondant isn't sticking at all, it's just coming straight apart. And that saves all the excess icing sugar from actually discolouring the black in this case and gives it a nice neat finish. Now if you make these in advance, make sure that you store them in Glad wrap or a sandwich bag or anything like that. Double wrap it, keep that air out of there, and they'll actually stay good in a cool, dry place for, you know, months to come. So it's definitely a good idea to do that in advance, and that'll save you that time. So there's our paw print. Now there's a few little edges there that aren't quite flat at the end, and just use whatever tools you have just to maneuver the fondant so it's flat at the end. And there you go, there's our paw print. We've got about 11 more to do, so I'll move on with those and show you how to stick them onto the cake. Okay, so as you can see, I've put a couple of the walls on and just tested the M&Ms to make sure that they fit in there okay, which they have. Now with the M&Ms, basically what I've done is bought 3 packs of the bigger ones with the nuts inside and separated the blue, red and yellow out for the Paw Patrol theme colours. Now we're just going to alternate between the colours blue, yellow, red and some black. So next we'll put the black on. Now to stick, you can use sugar syrup, but I think that a mixture of Tylose powder and water actually gives a stronger hold. Now less is more in this case. If you put in too much, if you paste too much onto the wall, it's just going to slide around. So you just want a very little amount on your pastry brush. I created the walls earlier from fondant, Tylose powder added just to give it that stiffer feel so it doesn't bend down there at the top where it's not actually connected to the cake. As you can see, the fondant on the bottom layer is far from perfect, but it doesn't matter because you're going to be covering it with this wall and filling the top with the M&Ms, so don't worry too much about that at all. The only reason I've basically put it there is to give it a little bit more support from the other cake layers. So I'm just going to brush some of the Tylose mixture onto the back of this wall. I just cut these walls with one of those fondant tools, but of course you can use a stencil if you'd like to make it that little bit more perfect. What we're going to do is just hold it up next to the last wall and just to apply a little bit of pressure. It's just like a glue. And there's a little bit of a gap between there, so what I'm going to try to do is just maneuver that so it closes the gap there, which it's done perfectly. Now I should mention that before I've cut out these squares, what I've actually done is marked around the cake with about the size that I want and just put little slits in the fondant here just so I can measure out how big I need my squares to make sure that when we get to the other end there's not like a little tiny inch space left, and it's going to obviously give that a better look. Now that's sticking quite well. As you leave it a bit longer it's going to become a bit more firm. And then we'll just continue going around the cake with all the colours of the squares, and hopefully if my measurements are right they'll meet up nicely at the end. Towards the end of making the cake we'll actually put the badges on each of these squares, and that'll give it a nice personalised Paw Patrol feel.